Hello adventurers, I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman tricked by the Fae to sound like an Englishman. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Sorcerer. For those of you who are watching Unrolled Stories, the actual play on this channel, you might be aware that one of the characters, Adarin, is playing a revamped version of the Sorcerer class. This was a version that I wrote a couple of years ago called the Sorcerer Reimagined, and it was designed to kind of take the Sorcerer back to its core fantasy and see whether there was a better way to realize the idealized state of a caster who is innately in touch with magic. And with the new rule set coming in a matter of weeks for 5th edition, I think now is a good time to discuss the reimagined class, what it does to better enable the core fantasy, and whether it's more aligned to what you and your table want to do with the class than the official published class. So, let's get on with it. As with any class I design or redesign, I always establish the core fantasy first. This is the pillar about which the class will be designed, of which the mechanics will always harken back to, and is ultimately the ideal that the player wants to realize at the table for their character. With a core fantasy pillar in place, it's then very easy to always check that the mechanics I'm building refer back to that and enable it, rather than just being a cool mechanic. For the Sorcerer, it's about having something so innately powerful that has touched you and left an indelible mark upon your very existence that you are now able to channel the power of magic through a thought on a whim. To feel an innate power, an unrealized potential that if you could just learn to harness it, you could be one of the most powerful people to walk the material plane. The magic that you wield is spontaneous and innate. It is not fully controlled and yet always unrealized and always knowing that there is something more that you can unlock. And through your journey, you must learn to harness and direct it and better channel that magic such that you can use it in the ways that you want without hurting yourselves or others. To put it succinctly, you are a conduit through which magic itself is realized upon the material plane. And you need to learn what the safety limits are and how you can best use that magic for yourself and for everyone else. With this being a class redesign rather than a completely brand new class, it is worth looking at the original class and seeing what we think doesn't meet this core fantasy, or perhaps doesn't enable it in such a way that we feel like it's really interesting us. As a note, this class was written in compared to the 2014 version of the Sorcerer, so some of this commentary may not align with what's coming in 2024, but it's still relevant to discuss the class as it was and how the new version, the reimagined version, tries to better enable the core fantasy that we've previously discussed. For me, when I went into the class redesign, one of the things that always stuck me about the Sorcerer was the fact that it felt too much like the Wizard in being constrained to this very mathematical and linear spell slot system, and ultimately the only difference felt like a metamagic feature that could have been a subclass. Spell slots are a good mechanic, but for the Sorcerer, which is more impulsive and spontaneous with its casting, it feels kind of limiting. So I looked for a way to do that differently and allow the Sorcerer to feel mechanically and narratively different from the Wizard that it will always be compared to. Speaking of spellcasting, the way in which sorcerers get and learn spells also felt incredibly restrictive. It was when you leveled up, you learned a new spell, which sounds like you're teaching. It sounds like you're learning like you would a wizard, where they are adding spells to their spellbook and they're learning from the world around them in this very scientific method. But a sorcerer is spontaneous. They are touching this well of magic and trying to shape it into a magical effect that they need in that moment. And so dictating spells before you know you need them always felt a little odd to me, especially since you were kind of locked into those spells once you picked them until at least you gained another level. And suddenly you might find yourself unable to react in the moment with the new spell that you had because you needed something else. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly to most people, is the sorcerer doesn't feel like it's using their self, their body, their identity to cast magic. A lot of people suggest using Constitution as a spellcasting ability for the sorcerer because of this, showing that the sorcerer's blood is where their magic comes from, and so they channel it through their sheer physical prowess rather than anything else. Now, I don't agree with this premise. Personally, I'm sure it works for some people. I think mechanically it's problematic in giving Constitution, which is already very important to every character, more importance to the Sorcerer, and they suddenly only rely on a single ability for survivability and damage output, while everyone else kind of always needs two. But also, Charisma in D&D especially is focused on the strength of identity, the strength of self, how confident you are as a person in who you are and how you walk about the world. Which, for my core fantasy of the Sorcerer, speaks volumes, because it's about how confident you are in being able to touch that dangerous, unrealized potential inside of you and bring it forth and exert a control of will over it to shape it to the way that you want. To that end, I still think Charisma is ideal for sorcerers, and so the reimagined version continues in that vein. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore that premise of the sorcerer putting their body on the line to cast their magic. We want something in this class that allows the player to push themselves beyond their limits, to push the safe boundaries of magic, to find that spell, that effect, that final blow that is needed in the fight, potentially putting themselves in harm's way. We want a situation where we have Eleven from Stranger Things or Wanda from Doctor Strange, where they are pushing the limits of what is possible, ignoring the consequences of what is happening to their own psyche and their own physical body in the process. So, with our core fantasy set in place, with our thoughts on what the old class did well and where it needed changing in the back of our minds, let's discuss the actual Sorcerer Reimagined and how it goes about trying to realize that core fantasy and how it differs from the 2014 Player's Handbook. First things first, we have gotten rid of spell slots for the Sorcerer. Spells still work within a leveling system, but the Sorcerer does not have spell slots. This is to primarily differentiate it from the Wizard and have the two feel like very distinct, full arcane casters, while still running on the same system that everyone knows in D&D. To that end, the Sorcerer Reimagined makes use of the spell points alternative system that is available in the DMG. How this works is you have essentially a mana pool attached to your level that goes up as you level up, and spells based on their level use a different amount of mana points. The reason I've done this for the Sorcerer is this much better represents this innate well of magical potential you have inside you that you can draw upon during your adventuring day and shape to whatever method or purpose you need. While a wizard has learned their magic through rote, scientific, almost mathematical study where they learn discrete bands of energy, sorcerers aren't necessarily limited by that thinking. Instead, simply using magic in the way that they need in that moment, regardless of what they've done previously or what's coming up in the rest of the day. While a wizard may have to think about, I've only got 2 third-level spell slots, a sorcerer just thinks, I've got a well of magic, and if I'm only going to need to cast 3 spells today, I can make them all 3rd level. Alternatively, they might impulsively burn through their magic at the start of the day and find themselves tired and unable to tap into that magical well for the rest of the day. Sorcerers have to think about this as they learn their powers and figure out how best to manage that reserve inside them. The other thing to note about the Sorcerer spellcasting is that instead of choosing their new spell when they level up, they essentially get a blank space on their character sheet where they can leave it open until the moment they need a new spell. So what this looks like, instead of choosing between Misty Step or Detect Thoughts when you get to 3rd level, instead as a sorcerer you can have it in the back of your mind that I would like either of these spells, but I'm going to wait to see. And in that moment where you suddenly need to escape from a deadly monster, your sorcerer just panics, channels magic into an effect that would get them free, and they cast Misty Step. And at that point, they're like, oh, I know how to do that, and can now cast Misty Step for the rest of the game. Or alternatively, they're in an intense negotiation and they really want to know what the other side is thinking, and they just spontaneously end up drawing the thoughts of that person into their mind with Detect Thoughts. And suddenly they go, I can read people's minds now. This better represents the spontaneity of a sorcerer in how they use magic, almost having an idea of what they want to do and the magic flows into that concept, rather than the wizard's way of doing it, of there being this codified way in which we cast magic and them going, that's a useful thing. I will learn how to do that. And so the Sorcerer just feels more spontaneous with this class. It's a little more chaotic. It's a little more uncontrolled and able to exert their personal will upon the world rather than being constrained by magic itself. The other major difference is to how metamagic and font of magic works. Font of magic has become conduit of magic in the Sorcerer Reimagined, and instead of there being an amount of sorcery points that you have that you can switch for spell slots, instead now you have what is called a channeling die. And what a channeling die is attempting to do is to build a mechanic around that concept of pushing your body to its limits to achieve an effect. So you can use your channeling die in one of two ways. The first of which is via conduit of magic, where you can attempt to increase the potency of the spell you are casting by channeling more magic through yourself into the spell. This works by rolling the channeling die, and if you meet or exceed the mana points required for the spell counts as being cast at a level equal to the number rolled on your channeling die. The channeling die starts at a d4 and increases as you level up, matching the rate at which spells cost mana points. But if you roll below the mana required for that spell, you lose a hit die in the process of trying to channel more magic in, as it takes a toll on your body. It's up to the player what that looks like. They might start bleeding from their nose. They might get a pounding headache or stumble as their legs grow weak. The point being that their body is racked with some kind of mal-effect from too much magic entering their system and not having a safe way to dispel it. In terms of the actual mechanics, when you get this feature at second level, you have a d4 as your channeling die, and you have a number of channeling die equal to your level, which obviously goes up as you level up. So you can only do this a number of times per day, and it's risky if you do, but the odds of you being able to freely upcast a spell without any additional mana points being cost is really quite a powerful effect. The other way you can use channeling die is for the Sorcerer's classic metamagic ability, where previously all of these metamagics had a cost associated with them in sorcery points. Now instead, you can roll your channeling die, and if you succeed on meeting the mana points associated with the spell, you can apply a metamagic on top. This is instead of being able to freely upcast the spell, so it is a choice between exerting more power into your spells or exerting your will to twist them in a way that will catch your foes unaware. Now, an important element of all risk-reward mechanics, especially in D&D, is you don't want players to feel afraid of using these abilities in case they need the effect to go off and it won't. If you do fail the channeling die roll for your metamagic effect, you can still have the metamagic applied, but at a cost of your own physical well-being. You do lose the hit die, as we saw previously, but also your hit point maximum is reduced by the level of the spell. A minor debuff when you're only trying to twist a second level spell, but if you're trying to upcast and do this regularly, it can begin to take its toll. And when you're doing this in the middle of a fight, those hit points are critical. Is it worth it to get that metamagic off? What's more important to you? I do love risk-reward mechanics in TTRPGs, and finding a way to make them interesting is always a fun challenge as a designer. And having this almost two-tier element to the risk-reward, where the risk is just that you're going to be taking damage to still get the effect, is just an interesting trade-off as a sorcerer to consider how much you're willing to put your body on the line to channel the raw chaos of magic at your enemies. Now, as I've previously discussed in other videos, one of the key things when it comes to class design for me is that class features evolve as you level up. You don't just get a cool new ability that bolts onto the class and allows you to do a new thing. Instead, I want to see features that harken back to the initial features you get, the foundational elements of your class, and enhance it and show the growth that your character has gone through, improving their own abilities, in figuring themselves out, and realizing just what it takes to be a heroic adventurer in a dangerous world full of monsters. To that end, the remaining 4 features that the Sorcerer gets in the Sorcerer Reimagined all connect back to this ability to push themselves beyond their limits, to almost break the rules of magic because they themselves are magic. So at 6th level, you gain the Controlled Channeling ability, and this allows you to add your Charisma modifier to a channeling die roll to attempt to boost it. You can choose whether you want to do this on a roll that you failed to avoid the mitigating damage, or whether you want to ensure that you get that free upcast of a spell. Now, when you use this ability, it can only upcast a spell up to 1 level above the spell levels you can usually maximum cast. So, for example, you get this at 6th level. If you were casting a fireball and tried to use the channeling die on it, and you wanted to try and get it as high a level as possible, using controlled channeling, you can get it to be a 4th level spell slot, even though as a 6th level character, you don't have access to 4th level spells yet. This represents your sorcerer learning how to safely channel magic a little better and exerting their control over the raw power to better enable the effects they're trying to achieve without putting their body in harm's way. At 10th level, you get Forced Casting. At this point, your sorcerer has truly realized how interconnected their body is to the magical potential inside them. What Forced Casting allows them to do is to literally use their physical well-being and strength to cast magic. When you use an action, a bonus action, or a reaction to attempt to cast a spell with mana points, you can instead choose to expend a hit die and roll your channeling die. Should you meet or exceed the necessary mana points required to cast that spell, you cast that spell without expending any mana points from your mana pool, essentially getting a free casting of a spell purely through the use of your channeling die and a little bit of your vitality. However, should you fail the mana roll, the spell is not cast, and you instead take 1d4 force damage per level of the spell you are attempting to cast, as the raw stuff of magic flows through your body and leaves you racked in pain and anguish as you are unable to control its energy and it just bursts through your system. This is just designed to represent the sorcerer absolutely pushing the limits of all things that are considered safe, letting the power of magic flow through them and using their body as a lightning rod for the raw power within. This is incredibly dangerous, but the premise behind sorcerers is that they are incredibly dangerous and they are putting themselves on the line at all times to use the magic within them. Now, does this sound incredibly powerful, as a sorcerer could in theory just endlessly cast spells all day? Kind of. I mean, you're still limited by the number of hit die you have, but bear in mind that short rests are one of the best ways to heal, and you're not going to have those hit die to heal when you need them halfway through an adventuring day. At 17th level, you gain Instinctive Spells, which just basically represents you becoming so comfortable with a number of spells. These spells are so innate that you just kind of cast them with a mere thought, and the magic flows through you as if it's a comfortable friend that you've known all along. These spells you can apply meta magic to without needing to roll your channeling die. So if your sorcerer has become famous for always using Catapult, then you can always apply meta magic to it because they just have used this spell so many times, it's muscle memory to them at this point that they cast it, and the only thinking that they have to do is, how do I adjust this spell to be more effective in this moment? There is no risk associated with casting these spells because they are just, that flow line of power is so grooved in, so smooth that they don't even need to put any effort into the casting. And lastly, we have the Sorcerer's Capstone. I adore capstones because they represent the pinnacle of a class, something that only the greatest adventurers can achieve. And as a player, it's something you only get if you've been untempted by multi-classing through the entire campaign to try and get power early. So I always tend to ramp up my capstones and make them quite powerful because it represents both a commitment to the class as a player and your character becoming essentially the most powerful version of this class within the world. They should be a step above the rest. So for the Sorcerer, you gain Arcane Supremacy. When you use your Forced Casting ability, you don't have to choose spells from the Sorcerer spell list. You can choose a spell from any arcane spell list in the game. Bard spells, Warlock spells, Wizard spells, and Sorcerer spells are all available to you when you let the raw power of magic flow through you. There is no spell unavailable to you. There is no magical effect that you cannot harness and unleash upon your foes, as you are a singular point through which all of the power of magic can flow through and be channeled. You are not beholden to these arbitrary rules of magic, and instead simply wield magic in the way that you want in that moment. So that's the class. I genuinely do think it better represents the core fantasy than the classic sorcerer version we saw in 2014, which very much felt like a wizard subclass with its metamagic feature being the only differentiator, and in fact felt more limiting. Yes, it got more cantrips, but at the end of the day, we're here to cast big, powerful spells. That's what a sorcerer is about. Sorcerer is about uncontrolled magic and wanton displays of power that push the boundaries of what magic can and should be in safe hands. Now, it's worth noting that a number of the official subclasses from Wizards of the Coast do make use of sorcery points for class features, and obviously with the Reimagined class, we've got rid of those. So when you get the PDF, you'll see a section on official subclasses and how to adjust them to work with the Sorcerer Reimagined. For the most part, it's pretty much a one-to-one relationship. For the number of sorcery points you would have expended in the traditional class, you now just expend a channeling die instead to use the ability. The reason you don't roll the channeling die to see if the effect takes place is a concept in that your subclass is much more tangible than the harnessing of raw magic, and so it's a bit more reliable to use. It still takes a bit of your energy to achieve it, but you don't have to worry about it not going through, because the dragon that happened to give you magical powers, those effects are much more realized and part of you, rather than having to push magic through you to achieve it. The other thing worth noting is that subclasses that came from Tasha's and onwards all come with expanded spell lists, and the Sorcerer Reimagined takes this concept and rolls it back for all previous subclasses, giving them an expanded spell list as well. So for a subclass like the Wild Magic, you now have access to Chaos Bolt, Blink, and Confusion as standard. That automatically spells part of your spell list for you. And basically any spell that has a randomized dice roll or a little bit chaos comes into the Wild Magic Sorcerer. Same situation for stuff like the Storm Sorcerer that gets Thunder Wave and Core Lightning and Lightning Bolt, and all of the others. And they all also come with their schools of magic for changing them out if you want to subtly play them a little differently rather than just the core fantasy of that subclass. You'll also find in the PDF another subclass, a brand new one called the Fey Child, which allows you to embody the terrifying otherworldliness of the Fey, both charming and frightening in equal measure. You're able to send foes mad with damage dice while they'll charm to you, summon Fey spirits to aid you, and even take on a Fey presence that can strike awe or fear into the hearts of your friends and foe. Anyway, I hope you can see that through the class that the Reimagined Sorcerer better embodies the chaotic, spontaneous nature of the core fantasy in the way in which it both casts spells, learns spells, and adjusts spells, all working with slightly different methodology that makes them feel distinct from wizards. You can still relate the two with the certain spells that they're casting, but the way in which they achieve that fireball is so vastly different that they feel like fundamentally different classes now. Anyway, that's the video. I'd love to hear what you guys think of the Sorcerer Reimagined in the comments below. If you do want to go grab the class for yourself, you can find the link to the DM's Guild entry in the description below, where you can also pick up all of the other Reimagined classes as well. Or if you really want to see them in action, you can check out Unrolled Stories, the actual play on this channel, where we use all 4 Reimagined classes in the party, and you can see how they work within 5th edition. And if you enjoyed this video and what I do here, please do like and subscribe and hit that notification bell to make sure you get notified when another video goes up, and you won't miss a single episode of Unrolled Stories or another one of these Reimagined classes breakdowns. But I do believe that's it. That's all I had to say on the Sorcerer. So we will pick this up in another video next time. But until then, do keep an eye out for dragons, and I will see you next time.